Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thanks for joining us. As you can see on the screen, you've joined us for this is the first APRA AMCOS Insights session for the year, and it's grant writing and funding opportunities. And we're joined by the amazing Golden Grants. Now, first of all, I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from, and that's the Wandjeribarra people. And I'd like to extend and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend that acknowledgement to wherever it is that you're joining us from. Welcome, hello, and acknowledge also any of our First Nations people joining us tonight as well. So lovely to see you all. We can't see you actually, but we can feel your presence. Thanks for being here. So tonight, as you can see, we're talking about grant writing and funding opportunities. It's been a bit of a hot topic, and we have a fabulous speaker joining us tonight, Lorrae McKenna, and also joining Lorrae is her colleague Holly. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, Lorrae, to who you are, and it's a pretty impressive bio. So allow me to read that excellent bio. But first of all, what I might do, I'll just let you know the way this will work. So we will hand over to Lorrae soon, who will just be going through a presentation and talking through all of her hot topics and tips and tricks tonight. What we would ask for you to do is, at the bottom of your screen, you can see there is a Q&A facility. Please do use the Q&A, not the chat. It gets really messy if we start putting questions in the chat. In the Q&A, you can ask questions and we can answer those as we're going along. We'll probably hold off on a lot of those questions until the very end, when Holly and Lorrae will jump back on at the end of the presentation and answer a bunch of those questions. What I would suggest is please hold out on asking questions right now, because we haven't even started yet, and chances are they're going to get to your topic at some point in time. So perhaps sit back and listen for a while, and then hold off and ask your questions towards the end. I think that's everything. I'm just going to talk now about the amazing Lorrae. So Lorrae is the owner director of Our Golden Friend, and Our Golden Friend are a Melbourne-based record label and artist management collective. Lorrae has worked in the music industry for over 2 decades. So it's a pretty long list of achievements we've got going on here. She started out in marketing and publicity at Allen's Billy Hyde and Crucial Music, and taking on assistant management of acts, including The Living End and Gyroscope. In 2013, as the promotions and marketing manager at Remote Control Records, Lorrae signed and developed acts including Courtney Barnett, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Methyl Ethel, Client Liaison. There's a big long list, that's just a few. Alongside this, Lorrae was responsible for PR and marketing strategies for international artists such as Adele, Radiohead, The National, Queens of the Stone Age, Sigur Rós, Jack White. That is a ridiculous list. APRA AMCOS recognised Lorrae's amazing contribution to the music industry by awarding her the Lighthouse Award in 2019 for her passion, creativity and integrity. Lorrae currently sits on the board of the Australian Independent Record Labels Association, otherwise known as AIR. More recently, and the reason we're all coming together tonight, is that Lorrae launched Golden Grants, and that's really why we're all here tonight, because what this is it's a means of simplifying and educating artists on potential funding opportunities. So thank you, Lorrae. That's awesome. What a great thing that you've started, and what an amazing list of achievements you have. I am going to now pass over to you so that you can talk us through why we're all here tonight. So Lorrae, I'm gonna hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Hello, everybody. That was such a really overwhelming introduction. I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight. I'm actually calling in from LA, Los Angeles. I've been over in America for South by Southwest, and now just having a few days in LA doing some work before I come home. So first, obviously, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners who occupy the land. On the screen now is a little bit more information about the land, the original land occupiers of Los Angeles, and a little bit more information about them. So just acknowledging and paying respects to the elders and descendants, past and present. Yeah, and I'm really happy to be here in LA and also be here talking to you all about the weird and wonderful and amazing world of grant funding. So first of all, I think we'll start with a little bit of a background of what Golden Grants is, in case you're not familiar with us, because we're a very new organisation. We only launched officially in September last year. Obviously, I've worked in the music industry for an incredibly long amount of time, and the last 8 years of my career, I have focused on artist management in particular. And whilst managing artists, I have learned a lot about grant funding, to the point where I had a really great idea about how to make it more accessible to independent artists and people who find grants to be confusing and also not sure where to look for the correct information. So at Golden Grants, we currently offer a few different types of services, but basically I am wanting to empower artists to get a better understanding of the grant landscape in Australia, because we have so many amazing funding opportunities available. Sometimes it can be very confusing to know where to look, when is the right time to apply for a grant, and how the processes work, because all of the peak funding bodies actually have very different processes. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, but I'm starting like really, really basic, just with the basic understanding of what grants are and what you can apply for. And then we'll kind of build into more advanced like conversations about application processes, where are the best places to look, when is the right time for you to apply for a grant, and also, you know, how to best present yourself and how you should be presenting yourself in order to get funding. And yeah, so maybe let's move on, Holly. And this is also Holly, who's joining us, who works with me at Golden Grants, super knowledgeable about everything grant related as well. So what are grants? Hopefully everyone on this call has a fair understanding of what a grant is, but it's an amount of money given from a government organisation or a philanthropic organisation to a person or organisation for a proposed future project. And it also is money that doesn't require any repayment. However, it does require acquittals, which we will cover later. So it really is funding that's available from different peak bodies within Australia, which will help you get your creative project off the ground. And obviously, very specifically, we're talking about musical projects in this call, but we at Golden Grants do write grants for creative projects outside of music as well. So it's not specifically about music. It can be any artistic or creative project, but yeah. And so what can grants fund? You'll see on the screen there's a list here, but they can fund many, many, many different things in a musician's career. They can fund writing and recording. They can fund development of a live show, creating assets such as music videos, press photos. They can fund marketing and PR. They can fund touring, professional development, and many other things, actually. It's just about how you frame your project and present it to the peak bodies. And it's also, at Golden Grants, we take a really holistic look at the funding opportunities that are available to artists in Australia. So we look at first national funding, which is available all around Australia to anyone living in Australia. We then also look at state level funding, which is like state specific funding from the peak bodies in each state. And then we also look at local and local government and council funding, which is available to artists as well. We also when we're preparing information for our clients, we also look into other opportunities such as residencies, awards and prizes, and other philanthropic opportunities that might also be available to you. Next, Holly. When is the right time to apply for a grant? Now, this is an incredibly complex situation because you actually need to be able to provide quite a lot of information about your career when you're applying for a grant. So our recommendation is always to make sure that you are at a point in your career where you are going to be able to paint a full picture of why you require this money and why this is the right time for these peak bodies to invest in your creative project. The way we look at grants is that all of the peak bodies, which we'll run through shortly in the slides, are stakeholders and investors in your creative project. And a grant application should be viewed like you're presenting your absolute best case into why someone will be investing in your career and the trajectory and development of your music career. So what else do we have on this slide? Find the grant. So plan ahead, make sure you know exactly what it is that you're looking to gain funding for. Is it a tour? Is it recording the next record? Is it recording your first ever album? You need to have a very clear picture of exactly what it is you want money for, because if you don't have a clear picture, it's not the right time for you to be applying for a grant. Then the next step is to find the grants. And then next step is always planning and submitting early. So making sure that nothing is rushed. We'll get to this more. This is kind of just highlights of more slides to come. So I think we'll move on from here. Best practices. So you want to apply for a grant. How are you going to present yourself in a way that makes you stand out amongst a very competitive market of other artists who are all looking to gain access to money for their own creative projects? The best ways to show this are through clear project ideas and creative rationale, outlining why it needs to happen now. Why is this the best time for you to gain that funding? A realistic scope and a request for funding, and why the funding that you're requiring is integral to help the project move forward and progress. The peak bodies really love to see career progression in a grant application. It's one of the main things that they look for. They want to see where you've been, how you've gotten there, and where you're going, and how the funding that they're going to provide you is going to take your career to its next level. That's one of the most important factors, I would say, in a grant application. Clearly outlining where you've been, how you got there, and where you're going. Any questions or anything? I feel like I'm racing through this, so I'm happy for it to be a little bit more interactive if I'm going too fast.
I think you're doing great, Lorrae. Just keep on going.
Okay, awesome, because I just feel like I'm spraying out information and hopefully it's helpful and correct, and it's not overwhelming for everyone, because it's like there's a lot to cover. Okay, next slide. So each funding body, and we've got some slides coming up of all of the funding bodies that I talked about, the national ones, the state ones, and the local government ones. Every grant application is completely different. Unfortunately, in Australia, there isn't really a streamlined process across all of the peak bodies for applying for funding. So it's really important to remember, just because you've done a grant application with one peak funding body, for example, Creative Australia, it's not going to look exactly the same for when you're applying for your state government funding or your local council funding. It's really also important to note that when you're writing grants, be very specific for that particular grant that you're applying for. When you go into the peak bodies portal, they will have very clear and specific guidelines in there. And those guidelines are kind of like their holy grail. They're basically wanting you to make sure you tick every box of the criteria and every part of their guidelines is met, because especially when you're applying for example, national funding via Creative Australia, these rounds are highly competitive. As an example, in the last Creative Australia International Engagement Fund, which closed in September last year and was announced, the funding was announced in December, they had over 1,000 applications for that particular round. So it's incredibly important to make sure that when you're applying for grants with different peak bodies, that you're really focused in on what the guidelines and what the key selection criteria is for that particular grant, because it does often change depending on peak bodies, and sometimes the process is really lengthy, sometimes they want different things. So it's really important to just be very clear about following exactly what they want you to provide for them. Next. Yeah, okay, so I'm not sure where we're heading. Project title and description. So this is usually the starting point. So for an example, if say we were doing a grant application now, usually the very first thing that would be at the top of the application process would be the project title and the description. These two things can be some of the most important parts of a grant. The reason why is because you have a very short amount of characters and words to get across exactly what you want that funding for. And when numerous applications are put in front of a selection panel, sometimes the most direct and catchy project title will catch the eye of judges and will make them want to read more and want to get more in depth into the project. So I would say the project title and description are two very important things when starting a grant application, to make sure, because you only have a very limited amount of words, to kind of convince people exactly what you are looking for funding for. I hope that makes sense. Next section in a grant application will be usually a section about a bio or about you. Again, you will have a very specific character and word length of numbers to get this description across to the panel who is judging the grants. So it's really important to keep your about you section clear, simple, and free from any overly descriptive language. Don't copy and paste your bio. Our recommendation and best practices is to always write a custom-made bio for each of your grant applications that you do, making sure that it's specifically tailored to you and your career in that point of time. This section also should include an overview of you, your project, your musical vision, anything that is particularly diverse or exciting or different in your project. Sometimes something that can be really beneficial in a grant application is thinking outside of the box on a creative project, because hundreds and hundreds of artists are putting in applications to get funding for the next album, the next tour. But how can you make your funding application stand out from the rest of everyone else's? And this is when in your About You section, you can focus on key creative things that make your project different and make your project stand out from the rest. And then a clear outline of your career progression, which is what I spoke about before. Peak bodies really, really want to see where you've been, how you got there, who's on your team, who's been working with you, where you've moved from, where you've been, a really strong history of what has already happened in your career is really important to include. And then also where you want to go from here. Yeah, and then key achievements, milestones, any major awards, anything that has, again, helps you stand out from the pack. And then also including people who are on your team, any agents, managers, publishers, international team. Listing everyone who is directly involved in your project is super important as well, and helps build a strong case and story for where you're going and where you're moving to in your music career.
Lorrae, do you think we could possibly we've got quite a few questions coming through, so just thinking perhaps we might be best to address some as we're going, if that's okay.
Sure.
I might get Glenn to jump in, and Glenn's got some questions he's taken from the Q&A. Glenn, do you want to jump in here?
Hi, Lorrae and Holly. Hi, everyone. As someone who's applied for grants myself in the past, this is extremely helpful. So, and it's going to make my grant applications better in the future. So thank you for that. So we'll get through a couple of questions now. So we don't have so many at the end, but Tessa's asking, is it worth applying for grants when you're still an emerging artist?
This is something that we get asked a lot of the time at Golden Grants, and it's very interesting, because something that I haven't mentioned about the peak grant bodies is that grants are constantly evolving and changing. They're not how they used to be 12 months ago. The grants that are getting announced, that have been announced this year, have actually changed. And there's also been a lot of changes in people in the creation of Creative Australia and Music Australia, and having key people like Millie Milgate move into those roles. And we're seeing a lot of very different grants come through than previous structures of grants, which were really kind of based around, established artists. Particularly, there's a grant round coming up for Creative Victoria, which closes in a month, and Creative Victoria have actually changed the structure of their grant, where they actually have 2 grant rounds. One is for particularly for emerging artists. So it's actually the first time I've seen a peak body structure grants like that. Previously, it's kind of just been everyone all in together, but I think there's like a lot of restructuring. So particularly in Victoria at the moment, yes, there are emerging grants. And yes, if you're writing grants yourself, I think it's better to start as early as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be successful, but the more grants you write, the better you'll get at them. And the more grants you apply for, the better understanding you'll have about the processes and how they work. And so I think knowledge is power, and I would always empower emerging artists to apply for grants, but being realistic that they are competitive. And that's, again, why I started Golden Grants, is to empower people to learn and grow through grant writing. And offer knowledge that might not usually be available. Does that help?
Fantastic.
Was that a good answer?
Yeah, it was excellent. And someone's also asking about a similar question, a late bloomer, you know, a change of career musicians, like an older musician perhaps. What's available out there for them, and is it worth them pursuing going for a grant?
I would also say yes. And I would say we at Golden Grants, obviously we are a consultancy, so we consult with people, but we also are writing grant applications for people. And I think we recently, in the last 6 months of this business, we've actually had quite a few like later career musicians, because it does kind of get to a point when you transition out of management or transition out of labels, and your team changes, but you're still wanting to keep moving through your career and find resources in order to create music. So I think definitely still worth applying for, just making sure that your grant application shows your whole story and your whole path and really highlights why you need the funding for this next moment in your career.
Awesome. Donna asks, how important is it for the project to be culturally relevant?
I think it's really important. It's something that we have in further slides. I think diversity quotas are incredibly relevant at the moment in all peak funding bodies. You can write a near perfect grant application and get to the top 10% on the panel of selection. When it gets to that point, what we've seen historically, and we're obviously collecting data on this now since launching the business, is that you'll see in that top level that diversity is a key factor in the grant application, whether it be cultural background, LGBTQ, non-males, like those things are something that the peak bodies are definitely pushing up in their applications at the moment. I think to use the Creative Australia round, the international engagement round, which I spoke about, which opened in September, closed in December, was announced in December. That round, they funded 17 contemporary music projects. And I feel like it was, Holly can correct me on the exact number of this, but maybe there was 4.
It was 2.
Two
Yep.
white male projects in the 17 funding applications that were approved in that round. So being culturally relevant and all factors of diversity are very, very key in grant writing at the moment. And what we often say to our clients, and we do write grants for all white straight male bands, but you need to be able to include what you're doing to further like diversity. Like if you're an all white male project, are you taking all non-males or people of color as supports on your tour? How are you engaging with those communities if you're not representative of that? So that, I think it's also super important in a grant application, and it's what the funding bodies are really wanting to see.
Yeah, thank you, Lorrae. Great information. We might hold the questions. We didn't get through many. I know there's a whole lot more, but I'm conscious that you need to get through your presentation as well. So we'll come back.
I'm not sure we can keep it. I'm really happy to keep it really fluid, actually, because sometimes like we can just flick through the slides and I waffle on, and I really hope that what I'm saying is relevant and important to everyone. But I could talk about grants for a really long time. So yeah, let's keep going, Holly, on the slides and see what else we have in here to chat about. And then, if you have any more questions, Glenn, that are popping up that are relevant, just jump in and let me know. So
awesome. Yep. Thank you.
Right. On to the next one, or do you want to chat about this?
Okay, about your project. I'm kind of out of the flow of things now after the questions, but we can get back in. So this is where, in this section of the grant application, this is where you need to clearly outline what your project is and very specifically what you are looking for the funding for. So previously in the about section was specifically about you, where you've been, where you're going. This next section of a grant application is very specifically centered around your current project that you are looking for funding for. So really in this section, you need to be detailing the main aims of your project, what you're trying to do, record a new record, tour internationally, go to LA for a writing trip, create some type of interesting festival. There's like many different things that you can outline in that section. And then what you're doing, exactly when it is happening, where it will happen, who it's going to be happening with, how it's going to happen, and also why it's happening. These are doing the when, where, who, with, why section is incredibly important, because if you don't detail exactly how things are going to roll out and happen with your project, these people have absolutely no idea. You should assume that someone who's reading your grant application knows absolutely nothing about you. Even if you're quite established in your career, even if you've, done heaps of things, this section of a grant application needs to be written like someone who's reading it has never heard anything about you or your project or what you're doing before. So, yeah, including as much detail in this section of a grant application is incredibly important. Yeah, and then including timelines for where things are going to happen, locations, any other specific participants in the project or the tour, any other finer details. The more detail, the better. However, you only have a very limited number of words to get this out. So this is what, when we're dealing with our clients and writing grants, it's really about fine-tuning this section to provide the information in the most clear and concise way. Sometimes too much like hectic wording and over-exaggeration can be a bit laborious for panelists to judge and read. So it's important to just very clearly outline exactly what your plan is to do with the money. And then also including the outcomes for the project, and how this will further your career and what recording this record or doing this tour or doing this trip overseas will specifically do to further your career. And also how it meets the funding body criteria, which I talked about earlier as being one of the most important things. Always cross-referencing each section of your grant application with the funding body's criteria and making sure you've ticked every box of their criteria in each section of the grant application. Yes. Any questions on that before we move on to this gnarly topic? Glenn?
Keep going, I think, Lorrae.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many questions coming in. We're trying to put them all together so we don't ask the same question more than once.
No worries. Okay. The next section of a grant application is obviously the budget. Now, I would say this again is an incredibly important part of a grant application. It is something that will make or break a grant application, because as someone who has sat on panels and previously judged grants, I have seen people meticulously pull apart budgets and see that they're not real, they're not realistic, they're not fitting in, they don't make sense. If you are putting in a grant application and you just have one line in your budget, it's not going to fly. Your budget needs to be as detailed as possible, covering very realistic costs and recognizable prices. So putting in flat numbers and having like a budget which is like 20 grand and I'm spending 10 here, 5 here, and they're not actual like costs, which would be like a studio hire for 10 days, which is, you know, $1,050.50. Having the very specific and most realistic costs included in your budget, super important. So including everything, every part, every single moment of where you are spending your money on this project needs to be outlined in the budget. So for example, if we're looking at recording of an album, how much is the producer costing? How much is the engineer costing? How much is the mixer costing? How much is the masterer costing? How much is studio hire, session musician costs, your artist fees? What else? Per diems, any other tiny equipment hire, equipment rentals, special equipment that needs to be purchased. I can't tell you how important it is that a budget in a grant application is as detailed as possible. So yeah, I think just going through this sheet, breaking down expenses line by line, including absolutely everything, every cost that you perceive could be involved in the project, being as specific as possible. So as an example, this is a line that we often include in grant applications, which is musician fees. So $250 per person for 5 people for 5 shows. And then having a total cost of that in the line budget. Getting quotes and including the quotes, real world quotes in your grant application is really going to strengthen it. Having a quote from the producer or the engineer, the masterer, whoever is involved in the project, if you can include an actual quote as supporting documentation in the budget, it just makes it even more real. Because at the end of the day, we want to be presenting projects that are real and tangible, that a selection panel can't pick any holes in, and that also that a selection panel will also acknowledge that this project is going to go ahead regardless of the funding, because you've already spent a lot of time, you know, it's a real life project. You're not just applying for it because you want the funding. This is something that's going to happen regardless of the funding coming to you. Yeah, and also including to pay yourself as an artist in a budget line in a grant application is super important as well, and that can definitely be included. And I think that's, I can't stress to you how important it is to be as detailed as possible in budgets and have real world figures and real world quotes to really strengthen your project application.
Yeah, and on the last point, always include other income.
Yes, that is also super important because, as I said earlier, the funding bodies really want to see that they are just one investor in the project. They do not want to see that the entire budget amount is being spent by grant money. They want to see that there's other income and other investments being made. So your own personal contribution, ticket sales from shows or other income, any label advances, any publishing advances, these also need to be included in the budget to help round out the fact that you're presenting a case where, you know, they're just one stakeholder in the investment of the total project. Does that make sense? Probably not. There's going to be a lot of questions about that, I reckon. Okay, so again, another important thing to include in a budget is in-kind contributions. So these are non-monetary contributions to the grant This can be seen through free, donated, or borrowed goods. So if there's someone who is working on the project for free, or donating their services to the project, this information can also be included in the budgeting line and listed as in kind. So some examples of these are like accommodation, backline, volunteer hours from people who are involved in the project, wardrobes and styling and rehearsal rooms. Again, it's just another part to really like flesh out the details of your budget and make it look as real as possible, and also acknowledge any services or things that are being donated or provided to the project. Okay, support material. Here's another big one. I get to every point and I'm like, this is the most important thing in a grant application, but here's another one that at Golden Grants, we have learnt a lot in the past 6 months about what good support material is and what that looks like, and how best to be presenting that. Because again, a grant application is really amazing and it can be incredibly well written and outline everything. But if you don't have the support material to show the realistic outcome of the project, then it's not going to get up to the top 10%, which are going to be receiving funding. So each grant will have different limits on the number and type of support materials you can provide to them. Some of them will let you have 5 letters of support. Others only let you have 3. So again, as I spoke earlier, every peak funding body is completely different and offers very different support material portals, and they can also be a bit funky. So uploading support documentation and all of the things which are listed on this slide is definitely something you need to do well in advance of a deadline for a grant, because if you are on a day that a grant is due, potentially there's hundreds of people logging into that portal to upload their documents. So you want to make sure you have all of your documents and everything uploaded well in advance. But we'll talk about submitting grants in advance in a second, because that's another slide that's coming up. But letters of support and confirmation from project partners are absolutely key to a grant application. In most of the peak bodies, we'll call them letters of support, but we've actually started calling them letters of confirmation at Golden Grants, because what we've learned is that a letter that is basically from someone who is directly involved in a project. So if we're looking at an application for an album funding, having a letter which is from the producer that you're going to work with saying, "Hello, my name is Shauna Everett, and I am going to produce this amazing album by this amazing band, and this is why they love them. This is why I love them. These are the dates that we've booked in the studio. This is the studio where we're going to record it. These are all the things that I'm going to do, and I can't wait to work on this incredible project with them. And that's why I think they should receive funding." So the confirmation letters of people who are directly involved in the project are far stronger than a letter from someone who might just be a friend or a lawyer or something like that, who's just writing a wishy-washy letter saying, "Hello, it's me. I think insert artist name here is amazing and they should get money." That is not going to be weighted as highly as a letter of confirmation from someone directly involved in the project. So again, if we're looking to use an example of like a touring grant, you would want to have letters of confirmation from venues that you're going to play at, booking agents who've booked the tour, support bands that are going to play with you, or if you're supporting a band, the band that you are going to be supporting on the road. Those type of letters are going to be far more beneficial as supporting documents. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions about that, because I think that's a really important part. And then obviously including the quotes from people directly involved in the project, and then the artistic support material. Now, it is incredibly important to include your music in the grant application. You would be surprised how many people don't include links to their demos or music videos or songs or some type of example of the music in a grant application. Because again, you have to assume that the person who is judging your application has no idea who you are and has never heard your music before. So these artistic support materials are incredibly important to helping paint the picture of your music and where you're going. Yeah, that's a lot about support materials. Again, a very important part of a grant application. Okay, tips and tricks. So this is our little section of, you know, some little tips and tricks that I and Holly are very happy to pass on to you guys, that we've learned from an incredibly long amount of time of preparing grant applications and working with different artists on grant applications. Our first tip is to write as if the project will happen and is fully confirmed. So when you're writing your grant application, it's not like we might or maybe or we're thinking, or if this happens, we might do this. That language is just not going to cut it in a grant application. You need to be very clear and direct, speaking as if the project is happening regardless of the funding. And that everything is fully confirmed. Now, this can be problematic for people because often we have clients who are like, but we don't know what we're doing then. We're not sure. Maybe I'm doing this at this time. I'm not sure. Again, that's not going to cut it for a grant application, and perhaps it's not the right time for you to be applying if you don't have a solid plan and you don't have confirmation of exactly what it is that you want to do with the funding money. Another one of our tips and tricks is demonstrate support from outside partners, either in the grant text or in the budget. So this is like including your key people involved in your project. So managers, record labels, publishers, booking agents, venues that you're working with, other musicians that play in your band, anyone that's partnering with you on your music. You need to just demonstrate that who is involved in your team in the grant application, because that really helps paint a clear picture of who is supporting you on your journey. Clear and realistic timelines. Again, you want something to look like it is fully confirmed and that it is happening on these dates. So when you're in your about the project section, which is where you will include the timeline for the project, you want to make sure you are including timelines that are realistic and also that fit into the timeline of the grant. This is something that is super important. So when grant applications open, they will say for projects starting from this date. So it is incredibly important that you list in your timeline that the project is happening after the start date of the grant. You would be surprised how many people write grant applications and don't actually have the start date of their project falling after the funding date. So I can't again stress how important it is to make sure you have realistic timelines for your project, and then also make sure it's fitting into the timelines of the grant. And yeah, you can leave room for delays and changes. And it's also important to note that when you put in a grant application, it doesn't mean something is set in stone. So if you have put in a grant application and you've said you're working with this producer on this date, and you know, in this country or wherever you're doing it. Sometimes, as we know, the music industry is a wild beast and things change very quickly. So peak bodies are very open to, like, they might fund your project as it stands, but if you have changed your mind since the funding application has been approved, you can then go to them, and it's very important that you do this. If anything in your project, once you get funded, is approved, you can then go to them and say, oh, actually, that producer, I've changed my mind and I now want to work with this producer, or I now want to record in this country. You can let them know that after. So, but for the sake of a grant application, you want it to be very clear, but it is okay if things change after you get funded. Letters of support and confirmation from project partners. Here is a big tip. Go to these people early. If you are wanting to get a letter of support to include in your grant application, you need to be going out to these key people 2 to 3 weeks in advance of a grant deadline. Now, Holly and I work very hard with a lot of people in the music industry to redefine this culture of putting in grant applications in 24 hours or 48 hours. You're far, far better if you're spending more time preparing a really clear and concise grant application. It's worth getting these letters of support from people well in advance and not scurrying a week out from a grant application and hurriedly emailing your booking agents or your manager or this venue and being like, I need this letter in 24 hours. That is not a best practice. That is probably what I would say is a worst practice. And I would really love to re-educate people in the music industry about thinking ahead, planning ahead. And when you first decide that you're going to apply for a grant, immediately decide who the 5 people that you're getting those letters from are. And in some grant applications, it's less than 5 people, but mainly it will be 5, and go to them early. So you're not scurrying in the last couple of days to get those letters of support in and uploaded into your grant application. Yeah, and so as I've mentioned before, letters from supporters are great, but letters from people working directly with you in the project have a greater impact. So that's like a very key tip and trick from us. Okay, so here's a very kind of brief funding landscape. As I said earlier, Golden Grants, we look at the grant funding landscape from the federal, national funding bodies, the state funding bodies, local council funding bodies, and then also there's other peak bodies and philanthropic agencies that provide funding. But this is a pretty brief list of the main ones in Australia and where you can find them. So obviously we now have Creative Australia and Music Australia, and it's important to note that Music Australia is now the funding body for contemporary music specifically. So mostly all of the funding for contemporary musicians will come via Music Australia on a federal level now. And then there's Creative Australia, which will fund creative projects outside of contemporary music. Sometimes there will be, I mean, this is all very new. Obviously, the Creative Australia, Music Australia landscape is just really happened in the last 6 months. And there, as I said, it has rapidly changed. Grant applications have changed, processes are changing and getting updated on their websites all the time. So it's really important to keep checking, because sometimes, and as we've learned, you'll be working towards a grant deadline and guess what? They've decided to push it back by a month or change the application process. So it's really important to keep a good look across all of these like key funding bodies' websites. But we also at Golden Grants have a newsletter that we send out sometimes twice a week, sometimes once a week, with information and changes to grants. So if you want to subscribe to that, you can go to our website, which is goldengrants.com.au, subscribe to our newsletter, because we have been, again, to provide a resource to artists, we are wanting to like give them the most up-to-date information with changes and to kind of like demystify the process. We've created like a centralized channel of that, which is via our newsletter. So probably the most up-to-date information on changing of deadlines or changing of funding bodies can be found via our newsletter. But yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about that. Here are some of the most important upcoming deadlines for grant funding in the next couple of months. Specifically for contemporary music, Music Australia has their international engagement round, which closes on the 9th of April. There's 3 different categories that you can apply for under this round. Obviously, there's far more detail on this on their website, but there's an international performance and touring activity, professional and artistic development, and market and audience development. And so this grant closes on the 9th of April. There's also the new Creative Victoria Music Works grant, which closes on the 18th of April. This is a newly announced project grant. And as I said earlier, it, for the first time, has been split into emerging artists, and then I think is it established and evolve, or export and evolve?
Export, yeah. For more established artists, yeah.
Yes, so the there's emerging artist grants for up to $5,000, which is like a very good starting point for, I would recommend anyone that's new in their music career, that is definitely the starting point. And then the next grant level up is for funding up to $20,000 for evolving and exporting. And then there's also the Create New South Wales Small Project Grants, which close on the 20th of May. And the Western Australia also has a major grant funding round, which closes on the 30th of May as well. These are like the key grant funding rounds that are closing in the next 2 months. But again, subscribe to our newsletter, because we're constantly sending through updates on deadlines and newly announced grants and all types of things.
Lorrae, this is totally amazing. Thank you. I cannot tell you, I don't think you can see the Q&A. There are huge amounts of questions and literally no time to get to all of them. So this is really wonderful. And I do think that even what you've just done, just providing that list of places that people can go to, I think any of those questions that we've received about, can I get a grant for? I think what we need to do is probably hold off on those questions and suggest that, I guess, people go and do their research and look at all of those places that you've just suggested. Obviously, more information, there is your email address.
More information, you can email us for more information, any questions. And yeah, obviously the services that we provide at Golden Grants, our first entry level service is a 1-hour consultancy call where we sit with you and we will hear all about your project, what you're doing, where you're going, and what you're looking for funding for. And then following that consultancy call, we then make recommendations of what grants you can apply for and what are most accessible for you. And then after that grant call, you can go off and write those grants yourself. We also offer a consultancy call, which is if you're writing a grant application and you're stuck and you need some advice or feedback or thoughts on that grant application, or if you need someone to look over the budget or anything like that, we also have a 1-hour consultancy call based around that. And then we also offer grant writing services and acquittal services as well. So they're all the things that we can help you with if you need that. as well.
That is amazing. Do you think we could maybe just ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay. It's already late in the evening here, and I am awake.
Way past your
So
bedtime already.
if people want to stay around and listen, they're more than welcome. I'm happy to answer a few more questions.
Thank you so much. We're trying to compile them down. Look, as I said, there are so many here. So I'm really, really sorry for anybody who's put in all of their questions and we're not going to quite get to them. But let's just try to, one thing that did come up is around proving your case. So how can you show that your project will go ahead regardless of funding, but also show a strong case for why you need the money? So we've had a couple of questions around that, people asking things like, they were told in their application that they should emphasize why the project has to happen now. What is the best way to do this, but also balance that it will go ahead anyway?
I think it's just having a very clear vision for the project and being really refined in how you're presenting it. And like, it's also around the language that you use in the grant application. It's being very clear, like I will go and record this here with these people, like no hypotheticals, I think, is like a best way to present it, and just being very clear and outlining exactly why now is the right time. And that can be with supporting documentation and like information about what it needs to happen now, because the album's coming out and then this is going to happen and then this is going to happen. So painting a clear timeline of your next 12 months and how getting this project funded and, how that will move forward. But I understand, hang on.
Yeah, it just ties in with your career progression. It's like, where are you now? Where do you need to get to? How do you get there through this project?
Yeah. And so it's also, but the question is like, how do you demonstrate that if you don't have the money? Like because I understand that can be a key factor for artists, is like, I can't figure out how to do this because I can't imagine ever having the resources of that money, but it's presenting a plan. So it's like kind of like a business plan or a project plan, and making it as clear and realistic as possible. Yeah, and at the end of the day, it is a plan, and if it doesn't go ahead, that's okay, but you want it to look like it is,
that's great advice. No, that's good. And I think looking at it as a business plan, that's a really good way of, I think, for people to wrap their brain around what it is that they're putting down on paper. The concept of a business plan, I think, is really, that translates really well. Glenn, do you have a question that you think is pretty burning that we need to ask?
Well, just a couple of things. People were asking if there are any templates for grants that they could use, and I'm sure they could just contact you directly for that sort of thing, perhaps. I
mean, yeah, we don't really have templates, because I feel, I have a lot of feelings about this. Like, you can have the ChatGPT write a grant, but it's not really going to be good. Like,
that was another question
also,
about using AI to write your grant.
You can, and you might be able to have that. Like, we've had a lot of, like, Holly and I buzz on
a lot of back and forth, but it just,
we're like, the bots are coming for us for sure. Like, we're the first ones to be made redundant by the robots. But like, I think that actually you have far more like knowledge within yourself and better ways of expressing grant expressing your
they're so personal. They're about your career and your project. You know best. The bot doesn't.
Is there any way you can see examples of successful grants?
That I feel is like, and this is, it becomes an intellectual property thing, like, because it is like, people are writing these grants. Like, we're not the first grant writers in the history of time. Like, and these are, that's like an intellectual property thing. I'm sure, I haven't done it, but I'm sure if you Google search grant applications, there might be some that exist. But yeah, there are,
do your research.
I'm not sure if there's a resource that would particularly show you a successful grant application, but we are working on a course which we're going to launch probably later in the year, which will be a really far more detailed breakdown of a grant application process, and we'll probably like troubleshoot specific things. But it's also really hard because, as I mentioned before, there's so many peak bodies. All of their application processes are different. All of them are looking at different key selection criteria. So this presentation that I delivered today is a pretty broad sense of like exactly what they're looking for, but again, it's very specific to each funding body.
A course sounds
Fantastic.
like a wonderful thing.
One more from me, Caroline, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Do you have a better chance at a grant if you don't ask for as much money?
I don't think so. I feel like it's it just all needs to look correct in the budget. Like, I think
it needs to make sense.
It needs to make sense. It needs to look real, tangible, and like realistic. And sometimes, you know, it needs to also appear that there is money being invested in the project from sources other than the grant funding body. So whether you're investing your personal money, or there's a label, or there's publishers, or there's other sources, like as I talked about, in-kind sources, as long as you, so I don't think necessarily it helps to apply for less. It's just about really outlining it and making it as detailed as possible, and showing where all the money is going to be spent and where additional funds have come from.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Lorrae, I feel like, and Holly, I feel like we could have maybe made this session for about 3 hours, but you know this better than anyone, because this is what you do on a day-to-day basis. I'm sorry, everyone whose questions we haven't gotten to, but if we could all clap, you know, from the privacy of our own homes, that's wonderful. Lorrae, Holly, that was amazing. Thank you so much for spending all of this time putting together all of this information. And I know it's really late for you, Lorrae, so please go to bed soon. And thank you so much for imparting your wisdom. This is really, really helpful. It is a massive topic to cover.
It's a massive topic, and that's obviously why I created this service. I've been an artist manager for a really long time, and you know, I only have the capacity to manage a small amount of artists, but I have constantly had many brilliant and amazing talented artists approaching me over the years to work with them. And I feel like Golden Grants is a way that I can help multiple different artists like gain access to funding and have a better understanding of what is actually available. So if we can help with that, please let me know.
It's fantastic, and we're getting lots of people just saying thank you, because this is really helpful, and we need people like you to impart your wisdom on us. So thanks for taking the time. We so appreciate it. Everybody, please join us for, we've got some more insight sessions coming up soon, so jump onto our website and have a look at our socials to see what's coming up. We'd love to see you again for our next sessions, and thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great night. Thanks for joining us.